They laughed when she bought a $7 tiny home, until her dog uncovered what was hidden inside. The auction lasted less than 3 minutes. In the fading industrial town of Millhaven, a 73-year-old widow raised her hand and bought a weather-beaten tiny home for $7. Neighbors whispered it was grief, not reason. But on her first night inside, her German Shepherd refused to rest, staring at a single wall like it was guarding a secret no one else could see. Be honest. Would you have walked away from that tiny house or stepped inside anyway? Tell me what you'd have done. The auctioneer cleared his throat and glanced down at the clipboard as if embarrassed by what he was about to say. Next item, he announced, voice echoing through the cracked speakers mounted to the side of the old brick municipal building. One off-grid tiny structure, all impounded for unpaid lot fees, sold as is. A few people in the folding chairs shifted uncomfortably. Most of them had come hoping for tools, lawn equipment, maybe a cheap trailer. Not this. The tiny home sat at the far end of the gravel lot like something forgotten by time. Its paint had peeled into uneven patches the color of old parchment. One wheel leaned slightly inward. The small front window was cloudy with years of dust. A sheet of tin roofing clung to the top, as if it were holding on by habit more than strength. Starting bid? The auctioneer asked. Silence. A breeze rolled down Main Street, carrying with it the faint smell of river water and rusted steel from the abandoned mill on the edge of town. In the third row, Evelyn Cross lifted her chin. $7. Her voice was steady, clear, not loud, but it carried. But a few heads turned. Someone near the back let out a soft, startled laugh. The auctioneer blinked. 7? Yes. He scanned the crowd. Any advance on 7? Nothing. A man in a denim jacket leaned toward his wife. That thing's not worth scrap. She shouldn't be here alone, the wife whispered, glancing toward Evelyn. The auctioneer waited another beat. Going once, going twice. He brought the gavel down. Sold. $7. A murmur rippled through the lot. Not applause, not approval. Something closer to disbelief. Evelyn rose carefully from her chair. At 73, she moved with the measured precision of someone who had learned to conserve strength, but there was nothing uncertain in her steps. At her side, a German Shepherd lifted his head from where he had been lying calmly at her feet. His ranger's coat was a deep sable brown, his ears alert, eyes intelligent and watchful. He stood as she stood, brushing lightly against her leg as if to anchor her. The whispers followed her toward the folding table where paperwork waited. That's Harold Cross's widow, isn't it? Lost her house after he got sick. I heard the boy wanted her in assisted living. She must not be thinking straight. Grief had become public property in Millhaven. It moved faster than traffic through the town's narrow streets. Evelyn signed the bill of sale without looking up, her handwriting steady, the loops of her letters as precise as they had been when she balanced household ledgers decades ago. $7. The clerk slid the paper toward her. You understand, it's not hooked up to anything, he said, almost apologetically. No utilities. And the lot lease expired months ago. I understand, Evelyn replied. She folded the receipt carefully and placed it inside her worn leather purse. Ranger remained seated beside her, posture straight, gaze forward. He didn't flinch at the laughter that broke out again near the edge of the crowd. The tiny home sat 2 blocks away, beyond a cracked stretch of gravel near the old rail spur where freight trains still passed at odd hours. Weeds grew high along the tracks. The structure looked smaller up close, as if shrinking under inspection. A teenager with a phone raised it discreetly, filming. $7, he muttered. Unbelievable. Evelyn walked up to the tiny front steps, 2 warped boards nailed unevenly together. She rested her palm against the door. The wood was cool and rough beneath her skin. Behind her, a voice called out, Ma'am, you sure you know what you're doing? She turned slightly. It was Mr. Halpern from the hardware store, arms crossed, concern and skepticism braided together in his expression. I do, she said simply. He studied the structure again. That thing won't last a winter. Evelyn's gaze drifted past him to the distant outline of the mill smokestacks, silent now for over a decade. Millhaven had known things that didn't last. Ranger climbed the steps first, placing one large paw onto the narrow landing. He sniffed along the doorframe, attentive but calm. When Evelyn reached for the handle, he shifted slightly closer to her leg, protective but not tense. Someone laughed again behind them. She's lost it. She just buried her husband. That kind of grief does things. The words hovered in the air like smoke. Evelyn opened the door. The inside smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic. Dust floated in thin shafts of light cutting through the small window. It was no larger than a modest bedroom. One narrow kitchenette, a fold-down table bolted to the wall, a built-in bench beneath the window. Compact. Self-contained. Unfinished. She stepped inside. The floor creaked softly beneath her weight. Ranger followed, pausing just beyond the threshold, scanning the room with the disciplined awareness of a dog who had once been trained to search disaster sites. Outside, the murmurs continued. A few neighbors lingered longer than necessary, curiosity outweighing courtesy. Evelyn turned slowly in place, taking in the space. The thin walls, the compact counters, the small square of ceiling vent above. $7. She did not smile. So she did not defend herself. She did not explain. Ranger settled near the door, eyes still watchful, as if aware that something had shifted, not just in the town's perception, but in Evelyn herself. Outside, a freight train horn sounded in the distance, low and echoing. Inside the tiny home, Evelyn Cross stood alone in the center of a structure no one else wanted, and for the first time in months, she felt the quiet weight of a decision that belonged entirely to her. The town could whisper. She had already signed. By late afternoon, the gravel lot had emptied. The folding chairs were stacked, the auctioneer's truck gone. Only dust and tire marks remained. Evelyn stood inside the tiny home a few moments longer before stepping back out into the cooling air. Ranger descended the steps first, while turning in a slow circle as if mapping the boundaries of this new territory. His tail moved in measured arcs, not excited, not anxious, alert. Millhaven's main street lay just beyond the rise. Storefront windows reflected a sky turning pale gold. The old textile mill in the distance cut a dark silhouette against it, skeletal and still. Evelyn closed the tiny door behind her and rested her palm on the handle for a second, feeling the cool metal against her skin. Harold would have said she'd lost her mind. The thought came without bitterness, just memory. 3 months earlier, she had stood at the foot of a hospital bed listening to machines hum. The room had smelled of antiseptic and stale air. Harold's hand, once broad and steady, had felt thin beneath her fingers. But for 18 months, she had watched illness take small pieces of him, his appetite, his patience, his strength, until the only thing left untouched was the quiet way he looked at her when he could no longer find words. The treatments had eaten through their savings like moths through wool. Insurance covered what it could. The rest came from accounts Evelyn had never imagined she would empty. When the doctors stopped saying if and began saying when, she had already known. After the funeral, the house felt cavernous. The refrigerator hummed too loudly. The clock in the hallway ticked with an insistence that bordered on cruelty. Every room carried Harold's absence like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Her son Daniel flew in from Arizona the day before the service. He walked through the house with the posture of someone calculating square footage. "Mom," he said carefully, standing in the kitchen where sunlight slanted across the countertops. "This place is too much for you now. The stairs alone?" "I've been climbing those stairs for 40 years, she replied. He ran a hand through his hair. "You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not proving anything." He looked around as if expecting Harold to step into the conversation and settle it. "Assisted living would make things easier," he said finally. "You'd have people around, meals, medical support." Evelyn wiped the same spotless counter twice. "I don't need easier," she said. "I need mine." Daniel stayed silent after that. The next morning, before his flight, he hugged her longer than usual. At the door, he hesitated. "You don't have to be alone." "I'm not alone," she said. At that time, it had not yet been entirely true. 2 weeks after he left, the house went on the market. The realtor staged it with neutral throws and bowls of polished fruit. Photographs were taken. The for sale sign pressed into the yard with a dull thud. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed. Evelyn signed those papers too. On moving day, she kept only what fit into a small storage unit and the back of her sedan. The rest went to estate sale buyers who examined her life like merchandise. She did not watch them carry Harold's workshop tools down the driveway. It was the quiet that followed that nearly undid her. She found Ranger at a regional adoption event outside a volunteer firehouse. A retired search and rescue dog, the volunteer had explained. 5 years old. Not a handler relocated out west. Good temperament. Highly trained. Needed a calm home. Ranger sat apart from the other dogs, posture disciplined, eyes attentive without pleading. When Evelyn knelt in front of him, he didn't jump or bark. He leaned forward slowly and rested his head against her knee. That was enough. Back in the present, she watched him now as he moved along the perimeter of the gravel lot, nose lowered, tracing invisible lines. The tiny home looked even smaller under the wide Pennsylvania sky. It sat alone between the abandoned rail spur and a thin stretch of brush where weeds tangled in dry clusters. She imagined Daniel's reaction if he saw it. He would think she had mistaken stubbornness for independence. He would think grief had unmoored her judgment. The whispers from earlier replayed faintly in her mind. Oh, she didn't flinch from them. After Harold's passing, she had discovered something unexpected about silence. It could crush you, or it could clear space. The suburban house had been full of echoes. This small structure held none yet. She walked back up the steps and opened the door again. Dust motes hovered in late sunlight. The space felt bare but contained. No long hallways. No unused rooms. No lingering shadows from the past. Control. That was the word that had taken shape in her mind the moment the auctioneer said $7. Not comfort. Not convenience. Control. Ranger followed her inside once more and sat near the door, eyes scanning as if cataloging exits and angles. Evelyn ran her fingers lightly along the kitchenette counter. The wood was rough in places, splintered near the edge. But the window glass was thin and clouded. To the town, this was evidence she had unraveled. To her, it was something else entirely. A freight train horn sounded in the distance, low and steady. The ground vibrated faintly as cars rolled along the tracks. Ranger's ears lifted at the sound, but he remained calm. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Outside, Millhaven's storefronts would close one by one. Lights would flicker on in houses she once visited for holiday dinners. Conversations about her $7 mistake would continue over kitchen tables. Inside the tiny home, the air held only dust and possibility. She set her purse down on the built-in bench and rested her hands on the narrow countertop. "This will do," she said softly. Ranger shifted closer, pressing lightly against her calf. For the first time since the funeral, the quiet did not feel like something swallowing her whole. It felt like something she had chosen. By the time the sun slipped behind the broken outline of the mill, Evelyn had returned to the storage unit for what she could carry in a single trip. 2 plastic bins, a folded blanket, a small toolbox, and a kettle she refused to part with. Ranger stayed beside her as she moved, stepping carefully across the uneven gravel. The tiny home looked different in the fading light, less like an object of ridicule and more like a small lantern waiting to be lit. Inside, the air was cooler now. Dampness lingered in the corners. Evelyn set the bins on the narrow bench and began arranging the few things she had kept. Framed photographs no larger than postcards, a faded quilt from her mother's house, a flashlight, and a portable camping stove she had purchased that afternoon. The space forced decisions. There was no room for hesitation. Every object needed a place. Every movement required intention. When she struck a match and lit the small stove, the faint blue flame flickered against the thin metal walls, the smell of heated metal mixed with the scent of old wood. She boiled water for tea, listening to the whistle of the kettle rise into the tight ceiling. Outside, a train rumbled past, closer than she expected. The entire structure trembled, the window glass vibrating in its frame. Evelyn steadied herself with one hand on the counter. Ranger didn't bark. He stood instead, muscles alert, ears angled forward, watching the walls as if tracking something beyond the sound. "It's just the train," she said softly. The rumble faded. Silence returned, thicker now. She unfolded the quilt over the built-in bench that would serve as her bed. The mattress was thin, but she smoothed it with practiced care. Ranger circled once near the door before settling down. For a moment, everything felt manageable. Then the wind picked up. It slid along the siding in a low, uneven whistle. Somewhere near the back corner of the tiny home, a loose panel knocked rhythmically against its frame. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her mug, feeling the warmth steady her palms. The first true night alone in a new place always carried weight. Even after decades in the suburban house, she had never liked storms. Harold had always checked the windows, tightened latches, reassured her that wood and brick were stronger than they looked. Now the walls were thin enough to hear the wind breathe. But Ranger rose suddenly, not startled, focused. He walked toward the kitchenette and paused beside the lower cabinets. His nose pressed close to the wall panel just above the floor. He inhaled deeply, then stepped back and pawed once at the wood. A soft scrape. Evelyn lowered her mug. "Ranger." He ignored the tone. His body shifted into a posture she recognized from the adoption demonstration. Alert, investigative, disciplined. He scratched again, more insistently. "There's nothing there," she murmured, though she hadn't checked. The panel was ordinary, painted the same dull cream as the rest of the interior. No visible damage, no gaps large enough for an animal. Ranger whined, low and controlled, not distressed, not playful. Another train horn sounded in the distance, longer this time. The tiny home shuddered faintly, but Ranger's attention did not waver from the wall. Evelyn stood and approached slowly. She knelt beside him, running her hand along the surface. The wood felt slightly uneven beneath her fingertips, but in an old structure that meant little. "You think there's something in there?" she asked quietly. Ranger's tail remained still. His ears did not relax. He scratched once more, sharper now. The sound echoed differently than she expected. Hollow. Not the dull resistance of insulation packed tight behind drywall. Evelyn withdrew her hand. A draft slipped across the floor, brushing the hem of her pants. She hadn't noticed it before. "Probably mice," she said, though her voice held less certainty than she intended. Ranger stepped back, but did not lie down. He positioned himself between her and the door, watching both. The wind pressed harder against the siding. The loose panel outside rattled again. Shadows shifted as the flame on the stove flickered. Evelyn extinguished it and switched on her flashlight, sweeping the beam slowly across the kitchenette wall. The light revealed faint scuff marks near the baseboard, subtle, almost hidden by years of paint. Ranger moved closer to the exact spot where the scuffs converged. She touched the area again, pressing lightly. The panel gave the slightest bit under pressure. Not much, just enough to notice. The beam of the flashlight trembled in her hand, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden awareness that this tiny structure, dismissed and neglected, might not be as simple as it appeared. "Tomorrow," she whispered. She was tired. The day had stretched longer than she admitted, but grief and scrutiny and paperwork and moving, all compressed into one decision. Ranger remained standing for another full minute, eyes fixed on the wall, before finally lowering himself to the floor. Even then, his gaze did not drift far. Evelyn returned to the bench and lay back carefully. The ceiling felt closer than any she had known. The walls held the wind like a drum. She listened to the night. Somewhere outside, weeds brushed against metal. A loose piece of tin clicked in uneven rhythm. Another train rolled past, its weight vibrating through the earth beneath the wheels. Inside the tiny home, the air felt charged, not hostile, not welcoming, simply aware. Ranger's breathing was steady but light, as if he were sleeping with one eye open. Evelyn stared toward the kitchenette in the darkness. The town believed she had made a mistake. Maybe she had. But as the hours moved slowly toward morning, one thought settled quietly beneath the noise of wind and rails. This small space held more than old wood and peeling paint, and Ranger seemed to know it. She closed her eyes, the faint echo of that hollow sound lingering in her ears. Outside, Millhaven slept. Inside the $7 tiny home, something waited. Morning came thin and gray, sliding through the small window in a narrow beam. The night wind had quieted, but the air inside still carried the scent of old wood and damp insulation. Evelyn opened her eyes to find Ranger already awake. He was not stretched lazily in sleep. He was seated, facing the kitchenette wall. She pushed herself upright slowly, joints stiff from the narrow bench. "You didn't forget, did you?" she murmured. Ranger's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but his focus didn't move. The hollow sound from the night before of a return to her memory. It hadn't been loud. It hadn't been dramatic. Just wrong. Evelyn stood and crossed the few steps to the kitchenette. Morning light revealed more detail than the flashlight had. The scuff marks near the baseboard were clearer now. Small, shallow scratches layered beneath years of paint. Ranger stepped forward immediately, pressing his nose against the lower panel. He inhaled deeply, then pawed once. Scrape. "Easy," she said gently. She ran her fingers along the seam where the panel met the floor. The paint was cracked there, as if the wood had shifted long ago. She pressed again. The surface flexed the slightest fraction inward. Not drywall. Plywood. Thin. While she sat back on her heels and studied the wall in silence. For 2 days now, if she counted the rest of yesterday, Ranger had not wavered. He had eaten normally, walked the perimeter, rested by the door. But each time he returned inside, he circled back to this same spot. It was not nervous behavior. It was trained behavior. Evelyn reached for the small toolbox she had brought from storage. Inside were basic tools: hammer, flathead screwdriver, pliers. She hesitated. If she was wrong, she would splinter the only interior wall she had. If she was right. She slipped the flathead into the seam at the edge of the panel and applied gentle pressure. The wood gave more easily than she expected. A faint pop sounded as an old nail released. Ranger stepped back but did not retreat far. His eyes followed the movement of her hands carefully. Evelyn pried the panel loose inch by inch. Paint flaked off in dry curls. Another nail released with a brittle snap. She worked slowly, breathing steady, careful not to crack the board completely. Finally, the panel shifted outward. Behind it was darkness. Not insulation. Not studs tightly packed. A narrow cavity. Cool air brushed against her knuckles as she widened the opening. "Good boy," she whispered, though her voice carried more wonder than praise. She angled the flashlight inside. Dust particles shimmered in the beam. The space extended deeper than she expected, about 2 feet back, maybe 3 across. A crawl space concealed behind what had appeared to be solid wall. Inside rested a metal tin, rectangular, dull with age. Beside it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, edges darkened by time. Loose pieces of insulation were tucked around them, as if to muffle sound. Ranger let out a low huff, not anxious, almost relieved. Evelyn sat back fully now, heart beating faster. This was not accidental construction. Someone had built this. Carefully. She reached inside and lifted the metal tin first. It was heavier than it looked. Dust coated her palms. The oilcloth bundle followed, dry but intact. She set both items gently on the narrow floor beside her. The tiny home felt different suddenly. Not abandoned, not neglected, but occupied by memory. Evelyn glanced toward the open doorway. The morning outside remained quiet. No curious neighbors lingered. No passing cars slowed. She opened the tin. Inside were folded papers tied with faded twine. Beneath them, a photograph curled at the edges. The image showed a woman standing beside what appeared to be the very structure Evelyn now occupied. Though newer then, paint fresh, wheels clean. The woman wore a military uniform, not ceremonial, work-worn. Her posture was straight, jaw set with determination. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the stack of papers. The top sheet was handwritten, ink faded but legible. Ranger lay down beside her, chin resting on his paws, watching. Evelyn unfolded the first letter slowly. The handwriting was firm, precise, and it began with a name, Margaret Doyle. Evelyn exhaled. This tiny structure, dismissed, mocked, sold for $7, had not been driftwood after all. It had belonged to someone who had hidden something intentionally, protected it behind wood and nails and insulation. And she glanced once more at the cavity in the wall. It was cleanly framed, deliberate. This had not been a child's hiding place or a forgotten repair. It had been built to keep something safe. Ranger lifted his head slightly, meeting her eyes. "You knew," she murmured. He blinked once, calm and steady. Evelyn returned her gaze to the tin and the oilcloth bundle resting beside her knees. The town had laughed when she raised her hand and said $7. But inside this small, weathered structure, inside a space no one else had bothered to look, there had been waiting something far older than ridicule, something preserved, something protected. And now, in the quiet of morning light, it belonged to her to uncover. Evelyn carried the tin and the oilcloth bundle to the narrow bench beneath the window. As morning light fell across the wood in pale stripes, illuminating floating dust like suspended breath, Ranger followed and lay close but not intrusive, watchful, as if he understood that this moment required stillness. Evelyn untied the faded twine around the stack of papers. The top sheet bore a date, October 14th, 1976. The handwriting was disciplined, slightly slanted, ink faded to a muted brown. "My name is Margaret Doyle," it began. "If you are reading this, then this place has outlived the reasons I built it." Evelyn's throat tightened. She turned the page carefully. Margaret described returning to Millhaven after serving as an army mechanic during the final years of Vietnam. She wrote about coming home to a town that had forgotten how to look at women in uniform. Employers who smiled politely but hired someone else. Housing offices that redirected her forms. Neighbors who asked why she hadn't married instead. The letters were not bitter. They were factual, measured. Margaret wrote of applying for veterans' housing assistance and being denied twice. Once for clerical error, once for eligibility review. She wrote of waiting in municipal offices beneath flickering fluorescent lights, while clerks shuffled her paperwork into thin stacks. "So I built something they couldn't deny," one line read. "If they wouldn't give me a place, I would make one." Evelyn set the paper down and opened the oilcloth bundle. Inside were carefully folded building sketches, hand-drawn plans for the very structure she now occupied. Measurements labeled in neat block letters. Notes in the margins about insulation thickness, wheel axles, reinforcement beams. And Margaret had not purchased this home. She had constructed it. Ranger shifted slightly as a freight train thundered past outside. The tiny home trembled under its weight, but Evelyn barely noticed. She returned to the letters. Margaret wrote about working nights at the mill while saving for lumber, about welding the frame herself in a borrowed warehouse, about designing hidden storage for documents that matter. Hidden storage. Evelyn glanced instinctively toward the open cavity in the kitchenette wall. The final letter in the stack was dated 1981. "If the town ever forgets what this place stands for," Margaret wrote, "then it will be because they chose not to see it." Evelyn folded the page slowly and rested it on her lap. There was a photograph tucked beneath the letters. She lifted it carefully. While Margaret stood beside the tiny home when it was new, paint crisp, roof intact. She wore work boots and denim, sleeves rolled up. Her expression held neither pride nor apology, just resolve. Evelyn studied the woman's eyes. She recognized that look. She had seen it in mirrors after hospital nights when Harold's fever wouldn't break. She had felt it when signing the closing papers on the suburban house. Resilience did not announce itself loudly. It simply endured. Outside, gravel crunched under tires. Evelyn looked up sharply. A pickup truck slowed along the rail spur road before continuing past. Two men inside glanced toward the tiny home, their expressions unreadable from this distance. Ranger's ears lifted, but he did not rise. The morning felt thinner now. Evelyn gathered the documents into a careful stack. No, she noticed something else among the sketches, a folded carbon copy of a formal letter addressed to the Millhaven Housing Board. In it, Margaret referenced a dispute over zoning classification and a federal transitional housing protection clause tied specifically to veteran-built structures. Evelyn read the paragraph twice. The language was legal, precise, almost defensive. She felt a subtle shift inside her. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. Margaret had not hidden these papers out of nostalgia. She had hidden them for protection. Evelyn stood and walked slowly to the kitchenette. The cavity in the wall seemed deeper now, darker. She leaned down and shined the flashlight inside once more. Dust, insulation, empty space. Nothing else visible. She pressed her palm lightly against the edge of the opening. Honest, the town had laughed when she bought the place. They had seen scrap wood and peeling paint. They had not seen this. Ranger rose and stepped beside her, shoulder brushing her leg. "You found her," Evelyn whispered to him. He blinked up at her, steady. She returned to the bench and began placing the letters back into the tin, but she hesitated before sealing it closed. Instead, she removed the carbon copy letter and the affidavit reference page, folding them separately. There was a knock on the tiny home's outer wall. Not loud, just firm. Evelyn froze. Ranger's body stiffened instantly, moving toward the door with controlled alertness. Another knock. "Ma'am?" A man's voice called from outside. "You the new owner?" Evelyn rose slowly and opened the door. A tall man in his mid-40s stood on the gravel. Clean boots, a pressed jacket, a folder tucked beneath his arm. He scanned the structure before meeting her eyes. "I'm Grant Halverson," he said. "I handle development in this section of town." Ranger stepped into view behind her, posture upright, but silent. Grant's gaze flicked briefly to the dog, then back to Evelyn. "Just wanted to make sure you're aware," he continued smoothly, "that this lot and surrounding parcels are being reviewed for rezoning. Commercial storage units. You'll likely receive notice soon." Evelyn held the folded letter loosely in her hand, unseen by him. "I purchased the structure legally," she said. "I'm sure you did," he replied with a thin smile. "But the land situation is complicated. Wouldn't want you investing time into something temporary." The wind lifted lightly along the rail line, carrying the faint metallic scent of iron and dust. Ranger did not move. Grant nodded once and stepped back toward his truck. "We'll be in touch." He drove away without waiting for a response. Evelyn stood in the doorway long after the engine noise faded. Inside, the letters lay open beneath morning light. Margaret's handwriting echoed in her mind. Documents that matter. Ranger turned and walked directly back to the kitchenette wall, sitting beside the open cavity as if guarding it. Evelyn closed the door slowly. The tiny home felt smaller now, but not fragile. Something had been built here before her, something deliberate. And whatever Margaret Doyle had protected behind that wall might not be finished protecting yet. The pickup truck's dust had barely settled when the silence inside the tiny home shifted from curiosity to tension. Evelyn remained standing in the doorway for a long moment, watching the empty stretch of gravel where Grant Halverson's truck had disappeared. The morning no longer felt gentle. It felt measured. Ranger returned to her side without command, pressing close against her leg, as if bracing. She closed the door slowly and locked it. Inside, the letters and sketches lay on the bench beneath the window. The open cavity in the kitchenette wall seemed to breathe with its own presence. Rezoning. Temporary. The words had been delivered smoothly, almost kindly. But beneath the polished tone had been something else. Assumption. That she would fold. Evelyn sat back down and unfolded the carbon copy letter Margaret had addressed to the Millhaven Housing Board. She read it again, this time slower. In it, Margaret referenced a dispute over classification of the lot as transitional veteran housing under federal review. She mentioned filing documentation tied specifically to the structure itself, rights attached to improvement, not underlying parcel. Evelyn was no lawyer, but she understood enough to recognize that Margaret had fought something here, and not quietly. Outside, a freight train roared past, rattling the thin siding. Ranger's ears lifted, but he stayed calm. Evelyn's pulse felt less steady. The town's laughter she could ignore. The whispers she could endure. But legal notices, zoning boards, development projects, those were heavier things. Her phone vibrated in her purse. Daniel. She stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Hi, Mom. His voice carried concern wrapped in forced lightness. I saw something online. She closed her eyes briefly. Online. Someone posted about the auction? A tiny house for $7? People are talking. She glanced around the small interior. The peeling paint, the thin walls. I'm fine, she said evenly. Are you living there already? Yes. A pause. Mom, this isn't you. She felt the edge of that sentence but did not react. You don't know what this is yet. I know it's not safe. And now some developer's probably going to push you out. You don't have to prove you can do this. She turned toward the kitchenette wall, toward the open cavity where Margaret's tin had rested for decades. No, I'm not proving anything, she said quietly. I'm staying. Daniel exhaled sharply on the other end. Just promise me you'll call if it gets complicated. It already is, she replied, almost to herself. After she hung up, the tiny home felt smaller. Ranger rose and walked back to the kitchenette. He stood in front of the cavity, looking inside again, then pawed lightly at the floor near its edge. Not the wall this time. The floor. Evelyn watched carefully. He lowered his nose and inhaled along the seam where the baseboard met the wooden planks. Ranger. He scratched once, short, controlled. The wood gave a faint echo beneath his paw. Evelyn knelt slowly beside him. You think there's more? Ranger shifted his weight and scratched again at the same plank. Outside, tires crunched over gravel. Evelyn stiffened. Not another vehicle approached, this time a white SUV with a municipal decal on the door. 2 men stepped out. One held a clipboard. Ranger moved to the door immediately, body angled, silent but alert. A knock sounded, firm, official. Evelyn stood and opened the door halfway. Mrs. Cross? The man with the clipboard asked. Town inspection. We've had notification that this structure may not meet current zoning compliance. That was fast, she replied. He gave a tight smile. Rezoning discussions move quickly. The second man peered around her into the tiny space. You staying here overnight? Yes. He scribbled something on the form. There may be issues with land use classification, the first man continued. We recommend you prepare for potential relocation. The word relocation felt clinical, clean, temporary, as Ranger's low rumble vibrated just beneath hearing level. Not aggressive, protective. Evelyn met the man's gaze steadily. On what basis? That will be determined by review, he answered. They handed her a folded notice and returned to the SUV. As the vehicle drove off, the paper in her hand felt heavier than it should have. Inside, she unfolded it carefully. Formal language. Preliminary review. Possible non-conforming structure. Temporary occupancy pending outcome. She lowered herself onto the bench slowly. The tiny home, which had felt like chosen quiet just yesterday, now felt exposed. The laughter of neighbors seemed distant compared to this. Rezoning. Review, relocation. Ranger returned to the kitchenette floor and sat beside the plank he had scratched earlier. His gaze remained steady. Evelyn looked at him, then at the letters, then at the floor. Margaret had hidden documents for protection. She had anticipated dispute. Evelyn reached for the flashlight again. If Margaret had fought something larger than mockery, then perhaps she had left more than memory. Perhaps she had left leverage. Outside, the sky darkened slightly as clouds rolled in from the river. The wind shifted direction. Inside the $7 tiny home, the tone had changed. What began as humiliation had turned into something sharper. Not ridicule, pressure. And Ranger was still pointing at the floor. Evelyn knelt slowly beside him, pressing her palm against the wooden plank he had scratched. The surface felt solid, but when she tapped it with her knuckles, the sound differed slightly from the boards around it, sharper, more hollow. Not today, she whispered. Though her eyes lingered, the notice from the town lay folded on the bench behind her. Rezoning review. Possible non-conforming structure. Temporary occupancy. The words pressed against her ribs like a hand. Margaret's letters lay open beside the tin. Lines about classification disputes, federal protections, rights tied to improvement, not parcel. If those words meant anything, they wouldn't mean it in this tiny room. They would mean it in an office. Evelyn rose and gathered the most formal-looking documents: the carbon copy letter, the reference to transitional housing protection, a sketch labeled Structural Improvement Designation. She slid them into a manila envelope she had brought from storage. Ranger followed her as she stepped outside, locking the door behind them. The afternoon sky had turned slate gray, with wind curling low along the gravel lot. Millhaven's courthouse stood 3 blocks from Main Street, a sandstone building with worn steps and brass railings dulled by decades of hands. The American flag above it hung heavy in the still air. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly. The lobby smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning solution. Ranger stayed at her side, calm and steady, drawing a few curious glances but no objections. His posture carried discipline. Even strangers seemed to sense he was working. Behind a long wooden counter sat a young man with dark hair pulled back neatly, glasses resting low on his nose. A nameplate read, Liam Ortega. He looked up as Evelyn approached. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," she said, placing the envelope gently on the counter. I need to find out if something was ever filed." Liam took the papers carefully, scanning the first page. "This is old," he murmured. "70s. "Yes." He motioned toward a chair. "Give me a minute." Evelyn sat, hands folded in her lap. Ranger positioned himself at her feet, chin lifted slightly, eyes tracking the room. Behind the counter, Liam disappeared into a back office lined with filing cabinets and computer terminals. The low hum of servers filled the space. Minutes passed. Evelyn studied the high ceiling, the faded mural above the entrance depicting Millhaven in its industrial prime. Smokestacks proud, river busy with barges. Another world. Liam returned, brows drawn together in concentration. "There's a partial record," he said slowly. Margaret Doyle filed an appeal in 1978 regarding zoning classification for a veteran-built dwelling. Evelyn's pulse ticked higher. "Was it approved?" He hesitated. "It looks like it was acknowledged, but the final affidavit isn't showing as recorded." "Meaning?" "Meaning she submitted paperwork, but the official notarized filing may not have been logged into the county system." He flipped through digital scans, then leaned closer to the screen. "There's a note here referencing federal transitional housing protections tied to improvement, not land. That's unusual." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "Would that protection still apply?" "If the affidavit exists and was properly executed, it could. It would attach rights to the structure itself." He glanced at Ranger briefly, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment. But without the finalized document recorded, it's complicated," Liam added. "Developers can challenge non-recorded claims." Evelyn's shoulders tightened. "So if I can prove the affidavit was properly signed and notarized?" He nodded slowly. "That would strengthen your position significantly. Even against rezoning?" "Especially against rezoning." Silence settled between them. Margaret had written about filing, but Liam had said the final affidavit wasn't logged. Evelyn pictured the cavity behind the kitchenette wall, the careful insulation, the deliberate concealment, documents that matter. "Would it help," she asked carefully, "if I located the original notarized affidavit?" Liam's eyes sharpened. "It would help a lot." Outside the courthouse windows, clouds rolled lower over the rooftops. Evelyn stood slowly, gathering the envelope. "Thank you." He hesitated before speaking again. "Mrs. Cross?" "Yes?" "Whatever she filed, it was intentional. The notes in the system show persistence. She didn't back down easily." Evelyn nodded once. "Neither do I," she thought, but did not say. Back outside, wind brushed against her coat. Ranger stayed close as they walked back toward the rail spur road. The tiny home came into view, a small shape against gray sky, stubborn in its stillness. Inside, the open cavity in the wall waited, and beneath the floorboard, a hollow echo still lingered. Pressure remained. The developer's visit, the town's notice. Daniel's worry. But something else had shifted. This was no longer only about staying. It was about finding what had been left unfinished. As Evelyn unlocked the door and stepped back inside, Red Ranger moved directly to the kitchenette floor and placed his paw precisely on the same plank. He did not scratch this time. He simply stood there, waiting. Evelyn looked down at the board. If Margaret had hidden the final affidavit anywhere, it would be somewhere even the town couldn't accidentally erase. The wind pressed lightly against the siding as the first drops of rain began to fall. Inside the $7 tiny home, hope did not arrive loudly. It arrived in the form of a trained dog standing over a single wooden plank. Rain tapped softly against the roof as Evelyn knelt beside Ranger. The tiny space felt smaller under gray skies, but steadier somehow, like a breath held before action. "You're sure about this?" she murmured. Ranger's ears tilted forward. He lowered his nose to the seam again and exhaled sharply, on as if confirming. Evelyn reached for the small pry bar in her toolbox. Her hands were steady now, not from confidence but from clarity. She slid the flat edge into the seam between the plank and the adjoining board and applied gentle pressure. The wood resisted at first. Then a nail squealed faintly as it loosened. Ranger stepped back, but kept his gaze fixed on the spot. Evelyn worked carefully, easing the plank upward inch by inch. The rain outside intensified, drumming softly against the thin roof. Another nail released. The board lifted enough to slip her fingers beneath it. She pulled. The plank came free. Beneath it was not empty subfloor. It was a shallow compartment framed between joists, precisely cut, lined with wax paper to protect against moisture. And inside lay a flat envelope sealed with aging tape and wrapped in plastic. Evelyn's breath caught. She reached in and lifted it carefully, dust coating her fingertips. The plastic crackled faintly as she set it on the kitchenette counter beneath the small window. Ranger stood close but did not touch it. The envelope bore a notary stamp in blue ink, faded but visible. Margaret Doyle. Evelyn swallowed. She peeled the plastic back slowly, then broke the brittle tape along the flap. Inside were 3 documents: a notarized affidavit dated 1978, a land survey correction bearing the county seal, and a formal acknowledgement letter referencing federal transitional housing protections for veteran-built structures. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. Rights shall attach to the improvement constructed by claimant Margaret Doyle. Permanent transitional housing designation. Shall not be displaced by subsequent rezoning without federal review. Evelyn lowered herself into the narrow bench, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. This was what Margaret had referenced in her letters. This was what Liam had said was missing. This was not nostalgia. This was defense. Ranger let out a soft exhale and settled beside her feet, posture relaxed now, as if his task had been completed. Outside, the rain began to slow. Evelyn stared at the affidavit for a long moment. The notary's seal was intact, the county stamp clear. The survey map attached to it marked the rail spur lot precisely. The rights were tied to the structure, not the surrounding land. Once she rose and walked slowly to the kitchenette wall, where the first cavity remained open. She looked inside once more, empty now except for insulation. Margaret had hidden memory in the wall, and protection in the floor. 2 layers of foresight, 2 layers of resistance. Evelyn felt something shift inside her, less fragile now, less reactive. The knock from earlier that day, the developer's polite warning, the town notice, all of it seemed smaller compared to the document in her hand. Her phone vibrated again. Daniel. She answered this time without hesitation. "Mom?" "I found something," she said. "What do you mean?" "Something that was left here before me. Something that matters." There was a pause. "Is this about the zoning thing?" "Yes." "Are you sure you want to fight that?" She looked down at Ranger. He blinked up at her, steady. "I'm not fighting," she replied. "I'm standing." The line was quiet. "Do you need me to fly out?" Daniel asked softly. Evelyn glanced around the tiny interior, the open floorboard, the rain-washed window, the documents resting on the counter. No, she said gently. I've got help. After she hung up, she gathered the papers carefully into a dry folder. The rain stopped entirely. Sunlight edged through thinning clouds, catching on the tiny home's worn siding. Outside, the gravel glistened. Evelyn stepped out onto the narrow porch, Ranger beside her. The air smelled fresh and metallic, washed clean. Across the rail spur road, two neighbors stood beneath a porch awning, watching. One lifted a phone briefly, then lowered it. Evelyn met their gaze calmly. She no longer felt like someone who had made a mistake. Inside the $7 tiny home, beneath wood that others had dismissed as worthless, Ranger had uncovered not just history, but leverage. And this time, when the town came knocking, she would not be empty-handed. The notice for rezoning review came formally 3 days later. A printed letter stamped and dated requesting Evelyn Cross's presence at the next town council meeting regarding non-conforming structures along the rail spur corridor. Grant Halverson's name appeared at the bottom as applicant representative. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it beside Margaret's affidavit inside a sturdy folder. Ranger watched from the bench as she closed it with quiet precision. The council meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening at 7. As Millhaven's town hall filled slowly that night, folding chairs lined the narrow chamber, and the overhead lights hummed faintly. A framed portrait of the town's founding mayor hung crookedly on the back wall. People turned as Evelyn entered. Whispers traveled quickly, quieter now than before, but curious. Some faces held open skepticism. Others, something closer to intrigue. Ranger walked beside her calmly, nails clicking softly against the linoleum floor. He settled at her feet once she took a seat in the second row. Grant Halverson stood near the podium, jacket pressed, expression composed. He gave her a polite nod that did not reach his eyes. The council chair, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and reading glasses perched low on her nose, called the meeting to order. Next item, she announced. Rezoning application for parcel designation, change along the Millhaven rail spur. Applicant representative, Mr. Grant Halverson. Grant stepped forward smoothly. He spoke about economic revitalization, storage demand, underutilized land. He referred to the tiny home as a temporary structure lacking compliance with current development plans. Several heads nodded. Evelyn remained still. When he finished, the council chair turned to her. Mrs. Cross, you've been identified as current occupant of the structure in question. Do you wish to speak? Evelyn rose slowly, folder in hand. Yes. The room quieted. She walked to the podium, placing the folder carefully atop it. Ranger stayed seated, eyes tracking her steadily. I purchased the structure legally through municipal surplus auction, she began, voice even. It was built in 1976 by a veteran of this town, Margaret Doyle. A few murmurs rose at the name. She opened the folder and removed the notarized affidavit. This document, she continued, was executed in 1978 and references federal transitional housing protections attached to the structure itself, not the surrounding land. Grant shifted slightly where he stood. Evelyn held up the paper, allowing the council to see the seal. It was notarized and accompanied by a land survey correction bearing county stamp. The council chair adjusted her glasses. Is this document recorded with the county? Evelyn glanced toward the back of the room. Liam Ortega stood near the wall, summoned at her request. He stepped forward. There is a partial record in the county system referencing the filing, he said clearly. The notarized affidavit itself was not logged digitally at the time, but this appears to be the original executed document. He examined it briefly, nodding once. The seal and stamp match archived notary records from 1978. A low ripple moved through the room. Grant approached the podium. With respect, federal protections would still require review under current zoning authority, which cannot override grandfathered veteran housing designation without federal consultation, Liam interjected carefully. The council chair held up her hand to quiet the crosstalk. Mr. Halverson, she said, did your application account for potential federal attachment to the structure? Grant hesitated for the first time. We reviewed publicly recorded filings, he replied evenly. This document was not present. Because it was hidden, someone muttered from the back. Evelyn's voice remained steady. It was preserved. The room fell quiet again. The council chair leaned back in her seat, studying the affidavit closely. If the structure carries attached federal protection, rezoning of the parcel would require additional legal review. She turned to Grant. We cannot proceed without confirming the status of this designation. Grant's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. Of course. The mood in the room shifted, not celebratory, not triumphant, but altered. Neighbors who had once whispered about the $7 mistake now watched with something else in their eyes. Recognition. The council chair cleared her throat. This matter is tabled pending federal verification, Mrs. Cross may remain in occupancy until review is completed. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Ranger rose from his position and walked quietly to her side, sitting at her feet as if summoned by the moment. Grant gathered his documents without meeting her gaze. As the meeting adjourned, several townspeople approached her hesitantly. I didn't know about Margaret Doyle, one older man admitted. She worked nights at the mill, another woman said softly. Kept to herself. Evelyn nodded politely, but did not linger. Outside, the night air felt cooler than expected. The mill smokestack stood dark against the sky. Ranger walked close as they made their way back toward the rail spur road. The tiny home waited under a crescent moon, small and quiet against the gravel lot. Evelyn paused on the steps and looked back once toward town hall. The laughter from auction day had not vanished from memory, but it no longer echoed as loudly. Inside the $7 tiny home, the hidden space had done more than reveal history. It had shifted the balance. And for the first time since she signed the bill of sale, Evelyn felt the weight of the town's gaze change, not from pity, not from ridicule, but from surprise. The small structure near the abandoned tracks was no longer an afterthought. It was a claim. And tonight, it still stood. The following week passed without further notice from the town. No additional letters, no visits from inspectors, no polished trucks rolling up the gravel. Instead, something quieter began to happen. On Thursday morning, a woman in her late 50s stopped by the rail spur road carrying a small thermos. I heard about the council meeting, she said, extending her hand. Name's Colleen Barrett. I volunteer with the Regional Veterans Outreach Program. Evelyn invited her up the narrow steps. Colleen stepped inside carefully, taking in the modest space with respectful attention. Ranger watched her for a moment, then settled when Evelyn gave a subtle nod. You said the structure was built by a veteran? Colleen asked. Yes, Margaret Doyle, Army mechanic. Colleen's expression softened. There aren't many programs in this county specifically for women who served, especially older ones. Evelyn rested her hand lightly against the kitchenette counter. The open cavity in the wall had been sealed again, the plank replaced carefully over the hidden compartment. The affidavit now rested safely in a waterproof folder inside a locked metal case. She built this because no one gave her a place, Evelyn said quietly. Colleen nodded slowly. Some things haven't changed as much as we like to pretend. The words lingered. Over the next few days, Colleen returned with 2 volunteers, retired carpenters who brought lumber and insulation. Not donations of pity, contributions of purpose. They reinforced the sagging roof beam, replaced 2 cracked boards near the base, caulked the window seams against drafts. Evelyn worked alongside them where she could, measuring, holding nails steady, sweeping sawdust into neat piles. Ranger moved through the space calmly, occasionally stepping close to the volunteers, offering a steady presence. One of the carpenters crouched to scratch behind his ears. Oh, good dog, he murmured. You found something important, didn't you? Ranger blinked slowly, tail giving one measured sweep. By Sunday afternoon, the tiny home felt different. Still small, still modest, but steadier. Colleen stood on the gravel lot and studied the structure with hands on her hips. You know, she said, we've been trying to find a temporary safe space for displaced female veterans waiting on housing placement. Nothing large, just somewhere controlled, private. Evelyn looked at the tiny home, the narrow bench, the kitchenette, the fold-down table Margaret had sketched decades earlier. Margaret had built it for control, for dignity. For someone who needs a week, maybe 2, Colleen continued. Not charity, just transition. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She imagined the room empty again. Waiting. Unused. And she imagined Margaret's photograph tucked safely in the metal tin. The affidavit sealed beneath the floor. The hidden space had protected legal rights, but perhaps it had protected something else. Would it be insured? Evelyn asked finally. Yes, we carry program coverage. And supervised? Always. Evelyn nodded once. It stays, she said. It doesn't get absorbed into a program. It remains what she built. Colleen smiled. Agreed. They began small preparations the following week. A fresh coat of paint, still neutral, still simple. A small brass plaque mounted near the door reading, Built by Margaret Doyle, 1976, preserved by community. 2023, Evelyn did not put her own name beneath it. Instead, she added one more line beneath Margaret's, For those who served and stand. Word spread quietly through Millhaven. So the same neighbors who once shook their heads now slowed their steps to ask if supplies were needed. A hardware store owner delivered extra screws. A local seamstress offered curtains cut from durable canvas. One afternoon, the teenager who had filmed her at the auction approached shyly. I didn't know, he admitted. About Margaret. Most people didn't, Evelyn replied. He nodded and handed her a small potted fern. For the window. Grant Halverson drove past once, slowing briefly before continuing on without stopping. The rezoning review remained tabled. Federal verification was pending, but the pressure that once felt immediate had eased. Not erased, but shifted. On a quiet Wednesday morning, Colleen brought the first temporary resident, a woman in her early 60s named Irene, shoulders squared but eyes tired. A ranger approached Irene slowly, tail low and relaxed. She knelt cautiously, and he rested his head lightly against her palm. Feel safe, she whispered. Evelyn stepped back, giving them space. The tiny home no longer felt like a $7 mistake. It felt intentional again. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the abandoned mill, Evelyn stood on the narrow porch beside Ranger. Inside, a lamp glowed softly through the window where the fern now rested. She had bought the structure for control. She had fought for it to remain. But standing there now, she understood something else had been uncovered along with the affidavit. Margaret had not just hidden protection beneath the floorboards. She had left a framework, a purpose waiting for someone willing to see it. The wind moved gently along the rail spur, while carrying the distant rhythm of freight wheels against steel. The tiny home stood firm, not as a relic, not as a mistake, but as a refuge. Autumn settled over Millhaven in slow, deliberate strokes. The air thinned. The trees along the rail spur turned amber and rust, their leaves scattering across the gravel lot in crisp spirals. The tiny home no longer looked abandoned. Fresh paint warmed its exterior. Reinforced beams held the roof steady. The small brass plaque near the door caught afternoon light in quiet flashes. Inside, the space felt lived in, not crowded, not cluttered, but purposeful. Irene stayed for 9 days. She kept mostly to herself at first, moving carefully within the narrow interior, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. Ranger became her quiet companion, lying near her boots when she sat at the fold-down table, walking beside her when she stepped outside for air. On the 4th evening, Evelyn found Irene standing in the kitchenette, fingers tracing the seam where the hidden compartment had once been. Someone thought ahead, Irene said softly. Yes, Evelyn replied. For people like us. Evelyn didn't answer. She simply nodded. When Irene left, housing secured 2 counties over, she hugged Evelyn with firm arms and pressed her forehead briefly against Ranger's. You kept something alive here, she said. The words lingered long after her car disappeared down the rail spur road. Weeks passed. Another woman came, a former medic who stayed only 3 nights before reconnecting with distant family. Then a widow who had served in logistics overseas and needed time to sort paperwork. And each arrival carried different stories, different silences. The tiny home held them all without judgment. Millhaven watched, but this time, the watching felt different. Mr. Halpern from the hardware store stopped by with a new lantern for the porch. The teenager who once filmed her now volunteered to help clear leaves along the gravel lot each weekend. Even the council chair visited one afternoon, stepping carefully inside the compact space. "I didn't know Margaret Doyle well," she admitted, running her fingers along the fold-down table. "But I remember the arguments. She was persistent." "She had to be," Evelyn replied. The rezoning review eventually returned from federal consultation. The decision was clear. The structure retained grandfathered transitional housing designation, as it could not be displaced without significant review and cause. Grant Halverson did not appear in person when the notice was delivered. The pressure dissolved quietly, like mist lifting off the river at dawn. One evening, Daniel arrived unannounced. His sedan rolled slowly onto the gravel lot, just as a freight train passed, the rumble echoing against the restored siding. He stepped out, taking in the tiny home with cautious eyes. "This is it?" he asked. "Yes." He climbed the narrow steps, ducking slightly beneath the doorway. Ranger approached him with measured curiosity before accepting a gentle scratch behind the ears. Daniel moved carefully through the small interior, studying the reinforced beams, the neat bench, the plaque near the door. "You turned this into something," he said quietly. Evelyn folded her hands lightly on the counter. "It was always something." He hesitated. "I thought you were reacting." "I was," she admitted. "Just not the way you imagined." They stood in silence for a moment, as wind brushed against the siding. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I'm proud of you." The words did not erase the months of worry between them, but they softened something. He stayed that night in a motel on Main Street, and left the next morning after helping replace a loose step near the porch. Winter edged closer. Colleen's outreach group formalized the tiny home's use as a transitional refuge, insurance paperwork finalized, a simple schedule established. Volunteers rotated quietly. The laughter from auction day had faded into memory. In its place stood something steadier. One afternoon, the teenager returned again, this time without a phone in hand. "My history teacher asked about Margaret Doyle," he said. "We're doing a project on overlooked veterans." Evelyn handed him a copy of the photograph from the tin. "Tell her story correctly," she said. He nodded solemnly. By late November, the tiny home glowed softly each evening, a single lamp warming the window. Freight trains continued to pass, their rhythm unchanged. But the structure no longer trembled under their sound. It held. One crisp evening, as the sky deepened to indigo, Evelyn stood beside Ranger on the porch. Leaves gathered at the edge of the gravel. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Across the rail spur road, neighbors paused occasionally, not to whisper, but to wave. The $7 mistake had transformed quietly into a landmark. Not grand, not celebrated with banners, but acknowledged. Ranger leaned lightly against Evelyn's leg. She rested her hand on his head. The hidden space he had uncovered had not only protected a structure, it had altered how a town chose to remember one of its own, and how it chose to see her. Autumn deepened into its final stretch. The trees along the rail spur nearly bare now. Evenings arrived earlier, folding Millhaven into a softer, quieter version of itself. On one such evening, Evelyn stepped out onto the narrow porch with a wool blanket draped over her shoulders. Ranger followed, settling at her feet, with the calm assurance of a dog who understood both duty and rest. The tiny home glowed gently behind them. Inside, the fold-down table had been polished smooth by use. The brass plaque by the door reflected the porch light in muted gold. A freight train rolled past slowly, its rhythm steady against the cooling air. The vibration traveled through the gravel and up into the porch boards, but the structure no longer trembled the way it had that first night. It stood firm. Evelyn watched the red signal lights fade into the distance and allowed herself to breathe fully. She did not think about the auction anymore. The laughter, the whispers, the cameras. She thought instead of Margaret Doyle, young, stubborn, returning from war to a town that had no plan for her. A woman who built something small not because she lacked ambition, but because she understood scale did not define strength. The hidden space Ranger had uncovered had done more than protect legal documents. It had preserved intention. Inside the tiny home now, a new occupant rested, another woman navigating the uncertain stretch between loss and stability. The lamp by the window burned softly, a quiet signal that the space was being used as it was meant to be. Ranger shifted, resting his chin against Evelyn's boot. "You knew," she murmured to him. "You always know." He exhaled slowly. She reached down and brushed her fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth beneath her hand. When she had adopted him after Thomas passed, people said it was too much responsibility, too large a dog for someone her age. But Ranger had not added weight to her life. He had anchored it. Across the road, a porch light flicked on. A neighbor waved before stepping back inside. The gesture was small, almost casual, but months ago it would not have happened. Evelyn looked toward the old mill smokestack silhouetted against the fading sky. Millhaven was still a town in transition, still uncertain, still carrying the ghosts of what it used to be. But now, on this gravel lot near abandoned tracks, something quiet and steady existed. Not a monument, not a victory, a space. She thought of the affidavit sealed beneath the floorboard once more, not because she feared losing it, but because she understood what it represented. Protection had been built into the structure itself. Margaret had not trusted the town to remember her, so she ensured the space could defend itself. Evelyn leaned back in the porch chair, listening to the wind move through dry leaves. So she no longer felt the sharp edge of defiance that had driven her to raise her hand at the auction. That edge had softened into something steadier. Choice. Independence did not mean isolation. It did not mean rejecting help or proving others wrong. It meant deciding where to stand. The $7 purchase had never been about stubbornness. It had been about refusing to be relocated out of her own narrative. Ranger shifted closer. Inside, the lamp clicked off, the occupant preparing for sleep. Evelyn rose and stepped inside briefly, checking the small heater, adjusting the curtain slightly so it closed fully against the chill. The space felt warm, contained, intentional. When she returned to the porch, the sky had darkened fully. Stars emerged faintly beyond the industrial glow of town. She sat once more.
Sometime what order dismissed as mound of foliage become the place where tranquil guiders. Security does not come from square-footed or abrupt approval. It comes from protecting what's master, especially when few people understand its value. Evelyn closed her eye for a moment, letting the night settle around her. The tiny home stood beside her, small, steady, and no longer overlooked. And beside her, Ranger kissed off, not because there's more danger, but because some space are worth guarding. Some homes are built with wood and nails, others are built with bristle. Evelyn didn't just protect a churcher, she protected a space where dignity could breathe again. If you were in a place, pretty walk away or stay and vote for something no one else believed in. Stay answer below, and if story liest one you, stay with for the next one.